Hey, it's Lindsay, and I wanted to remind you that CityCast is doing our annual listener survey. It just takes a few minutes, and you could win a $250 Visa gift card or CityCast swag. Head over to citycast.fm/survey. That's citycast.fm/survey. Today on CityCast Boise. A new study confirms that 35% of Idaho's OBGYNs have walked away since the Dobbs decision and our abortion ban laws went into effect. We're talking with the researchers and physicians about the long-term impacts and whether this data could sway lawmakers or voters at the ballot box. It's Tuesday, August 19th. I'm Lindsay Van Allen, and this is what Boise's talking about. Joining me today are Dr. Deb Roman, an integrative family physician and the past president of the Ada County Medical Society, and Dr. Ed McEachern with Health Services Research and the lead researcher for the recent JAMA article. So, what does losing more than 1/3 of Idaho's OBGYNs in less than 3 years reveal about Idaho's medical environment?
It's an interesting question. One of the things that we tried to do in this article is in June of 22, when Dobbs passed, we understood that there were certain rights that were going to be taken away from providers and from patients. And we hypothesized that there would be a change in the environment as a result of that. Didn't know what it was going to be. So we started out with a prospective study, cohort trial, that's what it's called, where you take a look at every practicing obstetrician in the state and then watch what happens, to them, see what happens. Do more people show up? Do less people show up? And I think what it does is it points to some difficulty in the ability to practice ways that physicians and patients would like to practice. It means that now the government is between what I think is a sacred relationship between a patient and a physician. And that makes it difficult for people to exercise their judgment that a physician and a patient get to together. We didn't look for causality here. That's another study that should be done and could be done. But what it does do is it indicates to us that something's gone on that makes it more difficult to practice.
Sometimes it's hard to understand the loss that you have when you lose that many docs in a community. There might be a perception that you can just bring in other docs, but many of these physicians have practiced for decades in our communities, and they are so familiar with the medical system and with the needs of the patients. They've developed relationships over generations, sometimes delivering someone's child and then their child's child. I think Ed told me sometimes even their grandchild's child. So many things are lost in that, when people feel that they can no longer practice in this state. And not only does it affect the medical community, because these are coworkers that are working in teams, so now it's disrupting the teams that we've built to be able to give the care. But these are people in our community who are our neighbors and our friends, and their children play with our children. And so it creates a real fragility in the community at large as well.
Just talking about those relationships built over years and years and years, I'm sure in some ways when you lose that, there is a level of trust lost between the community and how they view providers and their access to providers. And then for providers feeling concerned about, will I be supported by the community? Could I go to jail? Like, it really feels like this has created some major fractures, both on the provider side and the patient side.
Yeah, I think one of the things that, physicians, it's a hard job. You're on call every third or fourth night. And one of the things that is essential to the ability to treat a patient and for a patient to trust a doctor is to have unfettered access to that level of trust and to that acumen that somebody brings to bear in that relationship. And there have been studies that have looked at, what happens when you have this sort of thing show up. Well, delays in care occur. Restrictions that are in place about how we can actually offer care confuse both the patient and the doc because they're not lawyers. They actually want to give care. Often the thing that's prevented is needed, and you cannot provide care. And there's legal consequences to both the physician and the patient when these things occur. And so it's a big doggone deal when this occurs. The study we did shows that about 114 out of 268 docs left of that original cohort. So 43% of the people who were practicing medicine, who had their families here, who cared a lot about this community, who moved to Idaho. There's not an obstetrics residency in Idaho. Who moved to Idaho had to leave because they didn't feel comfortable with the environment. And so what you've done is you've taken between 250,000 and 500,000 patient visits out of our system. And what that does is it makes the system fragile. We work closely with family medicine obstetricians, with people who are nurse practitioners, with perinatologists and neonatologists. And when you take that many visits out of the system becomes more fragile, and it becomes increasingly burdensome for the people who work here to stay here.
To Ed's point, physicians do this because we really care about patients, right? And those relationships that are developed over so many years, there's a big disruption to your point, that the physicians feel, because they can no longer care for the patients that they really want to help. And the patients don't feel comfortable because they've developed this relationship over so many years where they feel comfortable walking in and talking about really personal things, knowing that doc knows their family and knows their situation, knows their financial situation, whatever it is, the things that might be difficult for them, right? And so it's a very important piece of that relationship that that Ed described as a sacred relationship. That's what makes it work. You know what I mean? That's what makes it work so well. So when you disrupt that by taking so many people out of the system, people are not always comfortable just coming in and starting new.
Need a reset or just a chance to slow down? Trade the traffic and to-do lists for a glass of wine and an open sky at Walla Walla. Just a scenic 4-hour drive from Boise, this peaceful destination in the heart of the Pacific Northwest offers a true escape from your hectic schedule. You'll have the opportunity to wander through more than 130 wineries nestled among golden hills and vineyards, and then cozy up in a tasting room. You can stroll through the charming historic downtown by day, and at night, dine al fresco on meals made by celebrated chefs from fresh ingredients grown just down the road on local farms. Come discover why Walla Walla is one of the Pacific Northwest's best-kept secrets. You don't have to go far to feel far away. Plan your getaway at wallawalla.org today. There are other states that also have pretty restrictive abortion bans. Did you notice that our rate of physician loss is comparable to those states? Are there any similarities with these other states?
The beautiful thing about Idaho is that it is small enough in its physician population for us to know every one of these physicians individually and often personally. In a state like Tennessee or Texas or other places that are that large, this kind of study is extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible, to do. And so we don't know what it is like in other states. For example, in Texas, there are more OBGYN residents, physicians in training than there are doctors practicing obstetrics in the state of Idaho. So it's a difficult thing to do. However, I suspect that there are similar trends that are happening. We do work with some researchers in Ohio and in Tennessee, and they're seeing similar trends. All of that is anecdotal data, not data that they've done a study like this.
I think what a lot of people wonder when they look at this data, a net loss of 35% of our OBGYNs in a very short amount of time. Realistically, what does that loss mean for maternal care, prenatal care, just gynecology care? What does that mean for people who are seeking that when we see this level of disruption?
We in Idaho enjoyed the dubious distinction of being dead last in the number of obstetrics providers per woman and reproductive age women. So if you take 43% out of the system, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that we've got a problem with access. And delayed care is bad care. And as the state of Idaho grows in population, we're adding about 10,000 people a month to the state. It's a problem for not only women and women of reproductive age, it's a problem for families. And so it's not just a women's issue. It's not just a family's issue. It's a statewide issue. The other thing is that when you think about what obstetricians do, they work with family medicine OBs and they work with nurse practitioners who deliver babies, nurse midwives. And that whole bunch of people work together as a system. If you take that away, it makes sense to me that the outcomes for women who are pregnant and having a child and the outputs of the care that an infant, a newborn infant or a fetus becoming a newborn enjoys would probably diminish.
Well, and I used to work as a NICU nurse, and there was a huge discrepancy between patients who knew they had a complicated pregnancy or where there had been complications that developed, which is not what anybody plans on when they get pregnant. And if they enjoyed continuity of care with providers that they trusted, those outcomes and our ability to prep for that situation was very different than when we kind of had, I guess we would call them crash deliveries, where they didn't, they hadn't had that relationship or they hadn't had that access to care. And a lot of times that heavily influenced outcomes, both for the person who was delivering and then for the fetus who would become our NICU patient.
Absolutely. And, the study showed that 85% of the OBGYNs who are practicing obstetrics are in 7 counties out of the 44 counties. So to your question about getting care, people potentially would have to travel bigger distances in order to see someone, right? And that has a big impact on whether they'll even go to see their practitioner because they have to take off of work and it's a lot for them to do. And so there's a lot of implications based on that.
I think one of the biggest tragedies this study pointed to was that there was a consolidation of obstetrical care provided by obstetricians to the 7 largest cities in the state of Idaho. And what we noticed was that there were people who, like, for example, would practice in Valley County, who then left Valley County to consolidate their practice back in Ada, which is the Boise area. And so what we're seeing in this state is, in an urban area, you might have to wait a little bit, and you probably still can access care. But in some of those rural and frontier counties, it's not available, full stop. And that was a trend we saw in the first year of our study, but it was actually really heightened in the second. The hard part about this is that Idaho does not have an obstetrics residency. So it's one of the few states in the country where if you want to practice obstetrics, you have to move to this state from a state where you have learned and trained and understood stuff. Most doctors who are in training stay very, very close to where they were trained, usually in the state, often in the same city. And Idaho does not have an obstetrics residency. So the task for the state now, and we're really interested in this getting better, is to recruit people, high quality people to this state who can practice obstetrics.
So do you think that Idaho can realistically recruit enough new OBGYNs under the current abortion laws to compensate for these losses?
It's going to be difficult. Again, we're looking for better, and I don't think anybody in this state wants to purposely put families at risk. And so I think there's probably an intent and now a conversation that would help us do that.
And you had your research peer-reviewed and published by the Journal of American Medical Association, or JAMA. Why did the research team feel it was important to compile this data in that very official way rather than relying on anecdotal reports? We've all heard, and a lot of people have probably talked to doctors who have left and doctors who are considering leaving, family doctors, any kind of care where doctors are concerned about this. Why was it so important to have this be an official peer-reviewed report?
That's a good question. What peer review does is it actually, we send this to a blinded set of reviewers, or the journal does. They look through that data. They actually validate that data themselves. And then they ask us hard questions about our methods and our outcomes. And then we have to justify to the editors and the reviewers that we did the study in a way. The other thing is it's done under the auspices of what's called an institutional review board, or an IRB. And you have to submit your research plan to this review board to make sure it's ethical and has sound foundation for science. The third thing is JAMA is one of the most prestigious journals and one of the most read journals in the world. It's one of the top 3 journals with New England Journal, Lancet, and JAMA. And we wanted it to be in a reputable journal. And we took great pains to make sure that the data that we had was accurate, valid, and reliable. And so we wanted to have that level of scrutiny. We asked for that level of scrutiny to make sure that this data was not wrong. And we wanted to know if it was wrong, what's wrong about it, and help me make that data better. So it's a very important way to make sure that we have the ability to trust this data instead of some fly-by-night person issuing a pamphlet that says this is what the case is when in fact it is not.
And we're hoping for the same thing in our state. We just hope that, it'll bring conversations, encourage people to have conversations with each other and say, well, what does this mean? Like the questions you're asking, right? What does this mean for access? What does this mean for my care? What does it mean for gynecologic care or other care? How is it impacting the other doctors? One of my friends who was a obstetrician for many years, he said that, he was called by an ER doctor who was in a rural area saying, will you teach me how to deal with the more advanced cases? Because I have a feeling I'm going to be seeing them because we just don't have enough coverage. So it's impacting not just the obstetricians, but it's the ER docs and the family medicine docs and all the different people in those teams. So we really wanted to bring it out so that there's a conversation, so that people can bring their insights. And like Ed said, is there something else we should be looking at? And then we can start to do other research.
And part of that conversation is that there's a ballot initiative or a movement for a ballot initiative for 2026 that would impact reproductive rights laws in Idaho. Do you think that this data could have an influence on that and an influence on how that conversation plays out around the ballot initiative?
I mean, anytime you have facts that are valid, reliable, and predictive, it matters. Having something that people can trust is true. And that should be part of the conversation. And I think it's also very important for us to have, again, it's a right and a privilege that we enjoy in the state of Idaho, that you have 50% plus one of the people who vote. The citizens have a right to change what the legislature is not being responsive to. And, whether or not our little study makes a difference or not really the question for me. The question is, are the facts there for people to evaluate what's important to them? And can we have a conversation about what better looks like? And that's the intent of what we try to do here.
After the Dobbs decision, the Idaho legislature has not revisited any of the Idaho abortion bans to modify them or to modify what exceptions there are or aren't. And almost every session, lawmakers say something about, well, we don't know how many doctors have left, or we don't know why they've left. We cannot verify this. Do you hope that having these hard numbers about doctors could impact the conversation in the legislature?
We would love a conversation that focuses on better. What does better look like and how do we get there? And I don't think it's a one and done. I don't think there's one thing going on that makes people want to either come or leave the state. But it's a multifactorial thing that we have it within our control to change. And that's what I think Deb and I were trying to do, was to be good stewards to start a conversation about what better looks like.
Yeah, I think we have a really unique community in that there is a lot of conversation that we have around issues. And Ed and I have always worked to create spaces where all the voices can be heard. Right. So we did not want this to be adversarial. This is not an attempt to say that someone did something wrong. This is more of an attempt to say, oh, with these circumstances, this is what we're seeing. What do you guys think? And to Ed's point, we're trying to look at the health of our community. How can we keep everybody as healthy as possible and have a really stable and vibrant community? So we were very, very careful that this is not an attempt to place blame. It is an opportunity for us to look at something together in a space where there isn't blame, there aren't assumptions. There's just people that are part of a community, who have relationships, who'd like to live in a way that feels healthy and nourishing, right? That's what we've talked a lot about bringing.
There was previous data years ago about a certain percentage of doctors leaving, and that has just grown to a net of 35% of obstetricians who are no longer practicing in the state. Looking at the research you compiled, do you think this trend will continue or could even accelerate if conditions in Idaho don't change?
Don't know. That was our hypothesis. We observed something that took away some rights and privileges of patients and physicians and put the government in between that relationship. And we said something's going to happen here. We don't know what. I think it's encouraging that 20 docs moved to the state. I think it's really discouraging that 114 left. And I don't think we have a hypothesis about what will happen next. I think that's the way you do science. Is you say, I think that there's something going on here. We'd like to observe it in the future, and we will. And I'll let you know next year what happened.
I look forward to it.
Yeah.
100%.
So if this trend does continue, let's hypothetically say, what do you see as the most urgent consequences for Idaho families?
I think we're in a world of hurt now. And if the trend continues, you've got this whole thing around access for women, not just women of reproductive ages. But you've got a system that's fragile that ends up having access problems for women. Delayed access and no access means worse outcomes. And so something that you had a couple of years ago has been taken away. And it affects not just women, it's families, it's men too. It's the ability for us to have a robust and productive workforce and a community that can take care of people who are in their reproductive ages. It has a ripple effect. The pediatricians also have trouble. The ER docs, the family medicine docs, the nurse midwives, the family medicine OBs, the perinatologists, neonatologists. It's a whole system that is fragile, and we should be concerned about it.
It really does come back to the well-being of the people in our community. The Ada County Medical Society has worked an awful lot to try to address the well-being of the medical community, but also, of course, that ripples out to the community at large, right? And what we're hearing from a lot of people in our community, not just the OB obstetricians, but a lot of our physicians, is that there are high levels of distress when you're in a situation where there could be prosecution and where there's confusion and when there's really, you're losing a lot of your colleagues and your teams are breaking down. The distress is really very visible. Ed and I talk about a situation where an obstetrician was the night before they have to go in saying, I just don't know if I can do it. I don't know if I can go in again tomorrow and not be able to take care of that patient in the way that I think they really need to be cared for. Right. So there's really significant impacts on the well-being of the physicians and other parts of the team. And that affects the patients, because if we're not well, then they don't feel like they're in a situation that is ideal for them as well. And the patients do care. Like I said, it's a circle. We care about each other. So everyone's impacted.
Well, thank you both so much. I know that you both work so hard, so I appreciate you taking the time to come on the show, break this down, and explain more of what this could mean for the people of Idaho and the people of the Treasure Valley. And thank you so much for your work doing this research.
Thank you for having us, Nancy.
Thanks for having us on.
That's all for today here on CityCast Boise. If you enjoyed the show, then it sounds like you'd be a great CityCast Boise neighbor. I want to shout out our newest neighbor, Marcia B. Welcome to the neighborhood. If you wanted to become a CityCast Boise neighbor and enjoy all kinds of great perks like ad-free listening and invitations to members-only events, head to membership.citycast.fm. We'll be back tomorrow morning to find out what's on the line for public radio since Congress cut their funding. Catch you then.